Good morning, and welcome to the 9th Annual Terrapin Supply Chain Management and Logistics Manufacturing Conference. Today in the past couple of weeks we've been faced with a challenge here in Singapore. If you could go over to that first slide of haze. And so this is a great tweet that I saw and shared with my friends back in the States of what they'd be looking forward to, especially from the view here at the top of Marina Bay Sands. So I hope that out of the next 2 days, you're going to gain clarity around supply chain, around logistics and manufacturing. And this morning, we have some very exciting speakers, starting off with Greg Sullivan of Unilever. Unilever and P&G have constantly for years changed the dialogue around logistics and manufacturing by sharing their peermanship against each other, one being better than the other, one case study being more successful than the next. Almost every business school, like National University of Singapore, where I am, and certainly a lot of business consultants and software companies refer to or have the brands of Unilever and P&G somewhere in their slides. And so it makes sense for us to start the day with Greg from Unilever. Greg was telling me that this is his 4th Terrapin conference. And so I said, wow, Unilever is that popular that they come in all the time and are sharing so much information. And with 25 years of experience, it makes sense he's bringing to us a great message about how to connect more with our consumer. But he connects with consumers in a unique way. For the past 3 conferences, he was here in the rock band, because he plays in part of a rock band. And I said, well, that's a well-rounded logistics person for us to hear from this morning. So without further ado, I want to welcome Greg up to the stage and also show you a little bit on the next slide that he touches us not only with what his thoughts are, but also his brand, Unilever, touches us in so many different ways across food, beverage, as well as our general life. So, Greg, thank you. Look forward to hearing from your remarks. And as a professor, I have to warn you, I always like to ask questions. I like to ask questions not only of the speaker, but of the audience too. So please, as you go through, feel free to ask Greg questions, but also be aware or on your toes. I'll be looking forward to having a good dialogue about what Greg shares.
Thanks, Keith.
Welcome.
So when I was young and a student, our professors were old with grey hair and generally grumpy, so I was a bit surprised to meet Keith this morning. I've got this really long title of my presentation this morning, but basically it's about leveraging manufacturing footprint. And what I want to talk about is some of the challenges that we face today, and in Unilever, what we're doing about that. Oh, I've got a button here, don't I? Of course, I have to give a short intro to Unilever, so I'm going to do this very quickly. But I think a couple of key points. We touched 51 billion euros turnover last year for the first time, 175,000 people or so. And 55% of our business is in what we call the developing and emerging world. And that's been shifting dramatically from just a little over 40% about 3 years ago. These are some of the brands. These are our biggest brands. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these. And if you probably hear a lot about Unilever and sustainability, but here is, from over 100 years ago actually, Lord Lever's vision for the company. And essentially nothing's changed. I mean, we've wordsmithed it a bit, but still today it's exactly the same vision that he had. Currently, what our plan is threefold. We want to double the business. That was a goal between 2010 and 2020, and we're fully on track to do that. Just think about it. This is the pace at which things change today, and it's part of what I want to talk about in my presentation. So it took about 120 years to get to the size we were in 2010, but in the following 10 years, we're going to double the business. So it makes sense that if we look forward in our manufacturing footprint, not just looking backwards, what do I have and how could I do this better? Look forward, you're going to create probably over the next couple of decades a very similar volume to what you've been doing in the past. We need to reduce our environmental impact, however. So what we've agreed is that we will halve the environmental impact at the same time as doubling the business, so that effectively our environmental impact would be neutral over the next 10 years. And what I'd like to say is we all agree it's not enough, because already today we're over-consuming as a population. So we need to do more than this. That's what we're aiming to do. That's what we're committed to do externally. And at the same time have a positive social impact. So our sustainable living plan is here. So help 1 billion people out of poverty, half our environmental impact, and source 100% of our agricultural materials sustainably by 2020, which for those of you in this kind of industry, you can imagine if you go back and look at your materials and all of those materials which are agriculturally based, and to have all of them certified sustainable is a mammoth task. We're on track, in fact, slightly ahead of plan in that area. And, you know, not that I'm competitive or anything, but just to show the Gartner supply chain rankings that just came out last month. And Unilever's ranked number 4, and the first in their FMCG group. So we're very proud of that, moving up from outside the rankings about 4 years ago, getting into the rankings 3 years ago, and now we're actually number 4. All right, that's the Unilever stuff, so now we can get on with the presentation, Optimizing Global Manufacturing. So life used to be simple, I think, when at one point in time I was working in Port Sunlight, which is just south of Liverpool, and I was working in a group called Investment Appraisal, and my job was to look at network optimization. And we used to optimize to see how many plants we needed within a geography based on lowest total cost. So that was an easy way. You know all the variables that are related to cost, and someone has a model that you can buy, or you can try and make one yourself, and you can then work out what the lowest cost supply chain would be for that network. Or, actually, sometimes it just comes down to leadership philosophy, where you have a leader of a business who says, I'm not going to have any assets. I'm going to outsource everything. That's not my core business. Or I'm going to have global manufacturing, lowest cost. Or someone who says, I owe it to my community. My community made me the way that I am today. I'm going to give back. My factory's going to be local, and that's where I'm going to produce. And I'm going to provide employment and financial support to my community. But things are changing, and not just changing like there's a trend in one direction. They're changing all the time, especially when you look at things on a global basis. So what have we been after? So global companies look at really deploying the scale economies that they have. Here's some examples of global supply chains. These companies tend to have a harmonized portfolio, harmonized processes as well, leading to economies of scale within manufacturing, particularly procurement as well, when you're procuring large quantities for a single site rather than smaller quantities across many countries, so economies of scale. But at the consumer end, there's less customization. It's more of a one-size-fits-all policy. And of course, you have longer lead times that you have to manage in this supply chain, and therefore inventory becomes critically important. So here's some examples of local supply chains. Not surprisingly, these are food companies. I mean, it's very difficult to find a global taste which every consumer likes. So generally, food companies do tend to be more local. Tailored portfolios, much more customized for the local market. Now, much more responsive. So especially in this part of the world, where forecasting is extremely difficult, not only just because of the demand side, but the fact that our trade customers, the supermarkets, etc., are competing against each other and will suddenly throw massive promotions to compete with one another. Fewer economies of scale, though, and here there's a big risk, and a risk we've seen in Unilever when we were very much localized, is that complexity creeps in, because my consumer actually prefers a green cap on this bottle. I know the global standard is blue, but mine needs to be green. And generally that can cause huge amounts of complexity. So is there a sweet spot? I mean, if there is, that's what Unilever is trying to do. We see our point of competitive advantage is that we want to have global scale, and at the same time, we want to have local agility. So we talk about we don't want to be mindlessly global or hopelessly local in the multi-local, multinational. So is it possible? Is it possible to have it all? I can tell you it's extremely difficult because global teams, global marketing want to act globally. Local chairmen and operating companies want to act locally in this environment. So when you're in a clear environment, you say, okay, local company, that's where the power base is, or global categories, that's where the power base is. Then the matrix is clear, everyone knows who's accountable, who's responsible, and therefore decision-making becomes easy. The minute you say I'm in the middle, everybody feels responsible for everything, and that can cause a large increase in your indirects and the number of people in the company, and a lot of debate and slowing things down. So how do you actually get the sweet spot in this? It's really taken a decade, I think, of rotating people around in the company through central and local jobs and getting rid of the competitiveness between each other in order that we're competing in the marketplace. I mean, our COO, Harish Manwani, talked last week, and he said, look, I've never met a global consumer. If I go to Brazil, I meet a Brazilian consumer. And if I go to the Philippines, I meet a Philippine consumer. I don't meet global consumers. So here, what we're trying to do is both think globally and act locally. That's, I think, you know, what a lot of big companies do. But at the same time, we want to, and bear with me on this, you have to think this one through, think locally and act globally. Because that's actually what we're trying to do in Unilever. Think locally, so work with local consumers, and then how do we, at a global level, leverage our scale to supply that consumer need? And that's the challenge for us. So now, you know, in the old days when I could talk to some consultant with a big model and they would tell me how they could give me lowest total cost, I think things are going out of models now. It really takes a lot of human judgment, a lot of experience and discussion in order to be able to work out what is the right manufacturing footprint. Of course, you have to look at different elements, but on the chart here, and I put my hand up, by the way, I wrote all of the slides myself, so apologies for that. I normally have much more talented people to do this for me. So cost is always going to be one of the primary drivers of working out a manufacturing footprint. And of course, you've got scale that you can get by putting bigger plants into fewer locations, and you've got responsiveness and risk by putting more plants around the world closer to your consumer base. I think cash is critically important with all of the turmoil economically, globally. Lots of big companies are just holding on to cash at the moment. And even though we have cash, we're not in a cash-constrained environment in our business, we're really constraining cash to our operating companies and to our categories. So we're expecting to double the size of the business, but we're expecting to do that with a lower capital ratio than we've been working with in the past. So that's another key driver. And of course, equally with the capital is that as you tend to go globally, you have to carry higher amounts of inventory, and therefore the whole balance of cash in this equation. Responsiveness is critically important. 55% of our business, as I said, is in D&E. If you take this part of the world, we have countries that have growth rates of pretty much close to 20%, like Vietnam and Indonesia, and big companies like Unilever India growing at well over 10% volume growth. So being able to respond to changes in pack formats, to promotional or competitive activities in the market is critical. And the closer you are to that market, the easier it is for a company to say, okay, I know that I asked you to do that, but I now need you to do this. And the factory can turn it around. So responsiveness is critical. And I think the risk element here about both geopolitical risks as well as actual natural risks. We're seeing cycles of increase for lots of reasons. Global warming particularly playing havoc with making the normal weather cycles much more severe than normal. And even in developed markets, we're seeing crises that affect our supply chain. So when you're designing a global footprint, you need to be agile to be able to switch supply from one place to another in the event that you have a natural disaster. And even choosing locations, would you put a factory into Japan? And if you would put it into Japan, where would you put it? Because the earthquake risk is real and it's high. And carbon footprint. So another element now about affecting not just the miles that our products are transported, but also the raw materials from the total product life cycle, and including the use and disposal of our products, meaning that the design of the formulations as well as the way the packs and technologies are formatted for disposal is critical as well. And underpinning that is that all of us have to act more responsibly. And you can see the emotion. I mean, there's huge emotion around tax, for example. I mean, tax should be a legal issue, right? Either you're obeying the law or you're not. No, it's actually becoming an emotional and a political issue. So when you're looking at setting up business for tax advantage, that's perfectly legitimate. In fact, tax is a cost we should avoid. But at the same time, we have to look at what the impact would be for a consumer, looking at us, seeing our brand, and saying, hey, isn't that one of those companies that's not contributing to the government here? Plus, the chasing of low-cost labor around the world. Fortunately, I think in FMCG, it's not a high labor-intensive industry. But at the same time, we do employ in some countries contract labor, end of line. In the past, we used to fail to get a business case because labor cost was cheap. So we could invest in automation or we can employ more people in factories. And I think as you see labor inflationary costs increase, automation has a better payback, but also it allows us to have more skilled people in our workforce, and of course we're prepared to pay more to get better people when we're looking at our skilled roles within our factories. So I think now, decision making, and I was talking to Keith because this is his field, decision making when you've got these kind of variables is much more complex than it used to be when you were simply optimizing on lowest cost. So I've just got a few points I want to land today about what are the trends then. So in trying to manage that, in trying to be agile locally and yet deploying global scale, trying to take account all of these factors, what are the trends that are happening in manufacturing? Because in 20 minutes, obviously, and I don't have an answer, I couldn't give you an answer and say, this is what you do, guys. Get out your Excel, and I'll help you construct a model. So let's look forward. Like I said, we're going to double our business. So in this region, we're around about 10 million tons of finished product. And if we double the turnover, probably 70% of that will be volume growth. So we're going to add 7 million tons in the next 10 years of manufacturing. So all of the sins of the past, where we put factories where we shouldn't have, these just become insignificant now. So I could look backwards and restructure. I could say, look at the network I've got. How could I make this network better? If I close these factories and put a restructuring project in, I can transfer the volume to this factory, which is cheaper. I've done my analysis and I can save money. But actually, that's not about growth. That's just about looking at how I could restructure existing cost. If I look forward, then I can say, where am I going to put my scale factories now? If I don't have scale factories, where do I have natural availability of materials, consistently good track record of performance, low geopolitical risk, low natural disaster risk, and good port, good civil service, good government practices, so I'm sure that my documentation is going to be accepted, that I'm not going to get caught up in corruption, delays, etc. The other thing is looking at vertical integration now. So I think in the 70s and 80s, and I was around in the 80s when we divested of all these flavor companies and chemical companies that we had. We were vertically integrated, but actually This wasn't vertical integration, this was a completely different business that was attached to ours. Now vertical integration is much more looking at, I have scale in a certain category, but if I look one step upstream now, there may be a supplier who's using a plant that I could use 100%. So if I could use 100% of that plant, I'm going to buy it myself. Because why would I be paying a supplier margin, provided I can understand the technology here? I'll take over that plant myself. And recently we put a fractionation plant, we just started the construction of a fractionation plant in Indonesia, which will do exactly that. We can use the entire volume from that plant. Modularization. I'm going to go through these in a little bit of detail. This is modularization of products and modularization of technology. So how can you have customization local to the market and yet build that customization of a product on a chassis which is global and therefore easy to shift around from a risk point of view? We have to look at what customization is actually relevant to the consumer. So if, for example, it's just the size of a bottle, that it's 250 mils in Philippines, that's the competitive size in the market, but 200 is more competitive in Thailand, but it's the same product, then we have to look at then how could we manage that? Is there really economy of scale by having blow molding just completely in one size? We'll at least make the cap the same. We'll at least make the formulation completely harmonized, and it's made on the same plant. So what can we tailor make to make it more relevant? And looking forwards, how are we going to negate inflation? Because look at labor costs in China, look at energy costs. So we need to continually reduce our manufacturing costs. How can we do that when we've got to give 15% labor increase next year? Plus, we're going to have increases in our gas or oil or fuel or electricity costs. So production efficiencies are obviously critical on the plants that we have. So here's the trends that, not just from me, SCM World, which is not the same as this SCM World, but it's a global think tank. They have looked at this recently as well. So the trend is not globalization anymore. The trend is regionalization. So as companies are getting bigger, we're finding that we can get economies of scale closer to markets than in the past. So if we start from global, we would move regional, and there's even some countries which have scale for the type of industry that I'm in, certainly, but maybe not for everybody. So we can now move scale plants into regions, have them closer to markets, and be more responsive, but take advantage of economies of scale. We can also take advantage of low-cost locations and fiscal benefits. We get reduced lead times, so we're carrying lower inventory than it would be if we had a global model, and we can reduce the carbon footprint. So regionalization is a trend. I don't know how many times Unilever's changed its regional structure in the last 10 years, but it's probably about 4, and we're about to do it again. And all of that is about trying to make sure that both at a business operational level from marketing and sales as well as supply chain, we're not having too many or too few regions, that we've got enough local, global interface. So vertical integration, I've talked about. There's a lot of onshoring taking place. There's still offshoring taking place, but a lot of companies are saying they're thinking about bringing manufacturing back in-house. It depends what your intellectual property is, how you value that. Our chief supply chain officer says this is the use of third parties ultimately is going to create a competitor in the market for us one day. So it can go on for generations, but what are we creating? Are we good at this or not? Do we have a competitive advantage? And having dedicated capacity allows you to be more responsive. You can plan how much capacity you need spare, depending on how good you are at being able to forecast the demand within your region or country. Harmonization, like I've said, consumer relevant, customization. We recently looked at Magnum. It's a great product in the region, to see how much we should harmonize, because we make Magnum in a few locations. But when we had the floods in Thailand, our ice cream factory was affected. We just closed it. I mean, it didn't get flooded, but we prepared for it. And we needed to get Magnum into Thailand from Indonesia, and we found that it was slightly different. So what needs to be harmonized? We found that, yeah, you need to harmonize the chocolate, that thick Belgian chocolate that cracks, you know, when you bite it. You need to harmonize the formulation, which, as you know, is a very thick, dense, creamy ice cream, and always one more bite than you can really eat. All of that needs to be but the packaging, as long as the spec's the same, you can have any artwork, because the reality is to change artwork's very quick. You don't have to hold high inventory of the wrapper. So, and we don't need to harmonize every variant. If we just harmonize the key variants, that, you know, the original one, vanilla, and the one with the almonds on it, then you can actually ship the product around in bulk, and you can still allow countries to have some local jewels, some local variants of their own product. So relevant harmonization. The use of modular technology. So in the past, uncontrolled, each factory would get some equipment locally made by pumps from local suppliers, and our factories look completely different. And then when you try and transfer an innovation globally, you find that you've got to do plant trials, need a lot more R&D people to go out and actually check that this formulation can be made on this plant, and how do I tweak the formulation so it's the same. Modular technology, same plants, modular formulations, means that you can really cut the time for a new product to market. And negating inflation is about continuous improvement, whatever you have, Six Sigma, TPM, world-class manufacturing, doesn't matter, just has to be driven and led. Using the network design going forwards to create the lowest manufacturing footprint because of leverage of scale. Using more technology and automation than ever before. And the business case is there because labor inflation is increasing. And of course, capital efficiency. So my thought for you, this is the last slide, is really that the new global supply chain is something where we're looking at more levels of regionalization, vertical integration, consumer relevant harmonization. We have to negate inflation and use of modular technology in both product and manufacturing technology. Thank you.
I really like what you talked about in terms of what we do right now today is so important for the future. Greg talked about decisions that were made in the 80s, challenges and changes to strategy, and so it's so important to hear what's been said and looking forward, and I like the forward-looking statement that you had. Any questions that are in the audience for Greg?
Increase is going to be correct. Because if that number is wrong, your whole supply chain design would also be wrong. So how do you ensure that your forecasts are at the level you expect it to be?
People change in our organization quite frequently, both at senior leadership team, you know, coming into a business for 3 to 5 years and then leaving, as well as quite high turnover in some of the more operational jobs. So it's never the case that you come in and you do a big complete S&OP program and suddenly you've got a great forecast system and you walk away and it stays like that. It changes all the time. Pressures that people are under in this competitive environment to hit their targets and in a volatile environment. The game playing about under forecasting and over delivering so that you can get a higher bonus at the end of the year, all of that stuff, I'm sure you know all about it. The other thing is you go to a more global supply chain, you have to place the order earlier than if you have a local supply chain. So locally, I can change next week's production forecast. But if I'm ordering offshore, sometimes the lead time might be 12, 13 weeks. And my forecast 13 weeks back is even worse. So all we do is back to basics. It seems to me, just my opinion, it's back to basics all the time. So it's a constant S&OP review, renewal, like a license to operate that we have within Unilever. And then it's putting the more sophisticated tools that we can start to bolt on to a global SAP system that can forecast more accurately than APO in a certain time frame. So, for example, we use Terra to give us a more accurate forecast in a 30-day time frame, whereas APO is much more accurate after 30 days, but in Terra software we use is more accurate because it uses pattern recognition. So we use some tools. Plus we're going into VMI, pull systems, driving inventory lower at the same time. It's just back to basics. I don't have a real sophisticated answer for the question.
And my question is, what were the challenges you faced in trying to get people in the company to change mindset about that? Because it's much easier to justify restructuring with clean return on investment sheets and so on. But how did you get people to think from the left side to the right side of your slide?
So it's not that we don't do any restructuring. But I think that what we've been focused on for the last 3 years, say, with our new Chief Supply Chain Officer, Pierluigi, is the industrial strategies looking forward 5 years. And by looking forward 5 years and just looking at the growth that we have in this region, so I'm looking at from my Asia, Africa, Russia region, the story is all about growth. So within that, there are choices that we have to make, because when we put some scale factories in and we look at the potential costs of those factories, it means that there are now factories which are no longer competitive. And we have to decide, are they strategically important because of the location, or should we close those factories? So that happens. At the same time, we have regions like Europe, where the growth rate in volume terms is very low. And therefore, it's much more about innovation driving the need for investment in technology. But the restructuring was done over many years to bring it down to a competitive cost base for that volume and that growth rate. So it is actually a little bit horses for courses, but in this region it's just purely by strategy. It's the minute you start looking 5 years forward and look at the growth potential that you have and make growth the number one driver of the strategy, and then cost and all the other elements as being secondary to that, then you'll find that you're not really looking at restructuring anymore.
I just noticed that in your strategy you've gone from, you've got a social aspect as well as the profitability aspect, and you've talked about moving modelling away from modelling and bringing in the more human aspect of it. So I was wondering, what are the implications of that for supply chain professionals inside your organisation? What sort of skills are involved? What sort of skills are required? And do you see an increased emphasis? I mean, you've got a large proportion of your business in emerging markets, you said. What's the impact of culture in your HR?
We're fortunate, I guess, because we have a central organisation sitting in various locations who are responsible for strategy, who are responsible for network analysis, deploying what we're calling our low-cost business models, which are kind of proprietary to us in the way that we work in and we deploy those. So we're fortunate to have that. There are still times when we need expertise, and that's when we will always bring in expert help, either through a tool that we may procure and deploy, or through consultancy advice, but it will always be of an expert nature. I mean, for us, just gone are the days of management consultants. We don't need advice on how to structure our thinking and how to prepare a strategy. Also, in terms of HR processes, I think we have a lot of cultural diversity in the company, right throughout all levels. We're still working on gender diversity, but it's a big strategy for us to equalize our performance there, because that also drives a better performance of the company. So we have that level of diversity and experience. In supply chain, I think probably the same for a lot of people, that the turnover of supply chain people is generally less You know, I'm 26 years in Unilever, and a lot of my colleagues are around, 15 to 25 years of service. So we have a lot of experience and the ability, therefore, to make judgments at the end of the day, our role. So there's no specific HR process for developing people for specialist roles. Really, there are relatively few of those roles in Unilever, and people gravitate towards them. And we employ very good professionals, whether it be in R&D, in supply chain development, supply chain strategy, supply chain network analysis, low-cost business models. So we do tend to have the ability to have that in-house expertise.
Okay, thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
And Greg, I just want to add, you said experience to be able to make good decisions. There's also reputation that you have to be able to make calls, and people will believe in them. So I asked a question to the audience for you to think about as we go through the day. Does your senior management see you as cost or as the fastest, highest quality way to touch the consumer?